Howdy y'all. The video that I'm making today is on a pretty controversial topic, so I'm going to start out with some disclaimers that you've probably heard if you've watched other videos like this, but I just want to make sure that we are starting out on the same page. The first thing that I wanted to say is that everything in this video is my opinion. I did do some research. All of that is being filtered through my experience and my lens. The next thing is that everything that I'm going to say in my video is going to be respectful, and so I would ask that if you have an opposing view, that you would be respectful in the comments. The last thing is, if you find yourself feeling angry or upset at any time during the video, I would ask you to just pause and think about what feelings you're having and why you're having them. I also kind of wanted to outline my lived experience to give you an idea of where I'm coming from as a trans person. So I came out at the age of 20. Before that, I did not have the resources or knowledge of the community to kind of understand what I had been feeling. I transitioned pretty quickly. I've been on hormones for 4 years, and in those 4 years, I've also had just about every surgery an FTM trans person can have. I also have a fiance who is F2M, and he has a very different experience than I do. I have a 5-year college degree in gender and sexuality studies, so I also kind of have an academic knowledge of the trans community. When we're talking about being trans and what it means to be trans, we should start with the definitions of cisgender and transgender. A cisgender person is someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So for example, I have 2 sisters, and they were assigned female at birth, and they identify as female, so they are cisgender. The term transgender means anyone whose gender identity does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So for example, I was assigned female at birth, I identify as male, therefore I am transgender. The big debate is whether or not we need dysphoria in order to be trans. If you look at the definitions, there's already an answer, because the answer is if your gender identity doesn't align with your sex assigned at birth, then you are trans. It doesn't say anything about dysphoria in the definition of transgender. But I do agree that there are some nuances that should be considered. So let's talk about dysphoria. There are 2 commonly known forms of dysphoria. There's body dysphoria or gender dysphoria, where you are feeling uncomfortable or distressed with your physical body and how that relates to your sex assigned at birth versus your gender identity. There's also social dysphoria, which is how society views your body or your gender or your sex assigned at birth. The bottom line is that dysphoria, as a definition, is distress or discomfort in your sex assigned at birth. A lot of people agree that it is just some form of distress or some level of discomfort. If you look at the definition of dysphoria as a diagnosis, you'll see that it says, the critical element of gender dysphoria is the presence of clinically significant distress associated with the condition. So basically, in order to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, you have to have enough distress in your sex assigned at birth for it to be clinically diagnosed. So if we're looking at the literal term dysphoria, not everyone would have it, because not everyone has a clinical diagnosis or access to healthcare. We as a Western society decided that we needed some definition in a mental illness perspective. The term dysphoria was brought to us from a cis white medicalized community in 2013 to diagnose us with some sort of mental illness. And it's not always seen in a negative light, because it does help us get access to healthcare if we need it. But that being said, it's not a term that we created for our community, and it's not a term that is widely accepted across every culture and every society. There are plenty of societies and cultures who have third genders and who have recognized trans people that are celebrated, that probably don't feel dysphoria because they never were taught to be ashamed or stigmatized about their identities. There's pottery that was found as far back as 2000 BC from Egypt and Greece that show signs of trans people that were alive. And we can't say whether or not they had dysphoria, because they existed before we had that terminology. They existed before we even had the words to describe how we were feeling. So while we're on the topic of words, let's dissect this word dysphoria. One of the arguments that I hear a lot is dysphoria equals distress. Dysphoria equals discomfort, right? We're putting these words on the same pedestal of each other. But the thing is that if someone doesn't identify with the word dysphoria, then that's not what they're feeling. If they don't want their body to be medicalized because they realize that word came from a medical community, then they might not use that word to describe their discomfort. And we're not here to say, those are the same thing, you have dysphoria. I'm sure some of you have been in situations where you've come out to someone and they've invalidated your feelings and they've told you, I'm not going to call you that because that's not what you're feeling. You're feeling this, right? And that's what we're doing to these people who are trying to come out to us. They're trying to turn to a community that they belong to and come out and be celebrated with us. And we are saying, you're not trans enough. We're telling them that they have to have a clinical diagnosis of discomfort in their life in order to identify as trans. I don't think that that's right. I think another important factor to look at with the word dysphoria is the intensity of feeling. The other day I was driving around with my fiance and we got in an argument. And after we were done with the argument, I told him that I was feeling frustrated. And he told me that from his perspective, I seemed pissed off. And for me, I don't think that I was that angry. I think frustrated is at like a 4 and pissed off is at like a 7. And I don't think that I was that angry. And I know that that sounds like a very small detail. And I know that it sounds really nitpicky, but that's what we're talking about. If someone says that they are uncomfortable or they are distressed, but they don't experience dysphoria, it might be because they don't feel dysphoria with the intensity that they are being shown as the rest of the community. People are constantly posting about how bad their dysphoria is and how they can't leave the house and how they can't bathe and how they can't look in the mirror at themselves. And if someone is experiencing discomfort but not at that level, they might not identify that discomfort as dysphoria. And it's not our job, once again, to say, you're uncomfortable, so that's dysphoria. Because if that's not the word they use to describe themselves, then that's not what they have. They are not experiencing dysphoria. While we're on the topic of social media, let's talk about where this argument is kind of rooted from, because I feel like a lot of the people who are on the opposing side that you do need dysphoria to be trans are mostly younger people. Not all, but I feel like a lot of them are still in high school or recently graduated from high school. They all seem to have access to some outlet for their transness. They have supportive families or they have access to therapy or counseling. Some of them have access to hormones before they're 18. And I am not saying that any of this is bad. Like, the younger generation of trans people is doing great. Like, if we would have had access to all of those things when we were younger, that would have been so, so, so helpful. But the fact of the matter is that 10 years ago, we didn't have anything like what it is today. We didn't have representation in the media. We didn't have anyone who was really worth looking up to. We had a handful of people who we could see had transitioned, but that was light years away from where we were as a community at the time. And we didn't have Instagram or access to other trans people at the touch of a phone. We didn't have DMing and social media where we could rely on someone to message us back. We didn't have access to resources freely, and we didn't have all the terminology that we have today to describe how we're feeling and the identities that we are aligning with. So while we're on the topic of terminology, I want to touch on transgenders and detransitioners, because I've heard a lot of arguments surrounding those specific groups of people, and I kind of want to take a moment to address the points that I've heard. So the first thing is that detransitioners or transgenders will make real trans people have longer wait lists for healthcare or for medical treatment, right? If you have been through a surgery for trans-related surgery, you kind of understand the process. But for those of you who haven't been through surgery yet, there are like two main ways to get surgery. Usually you can either have your health insurance cover surgery if that's something that they can do for you, or you need to pay out of pocket. Both of these methods require you to go see at least one mental health professional and have them conclude that you are at least in a sound state of mind that you can make informed decisions about your body and your health. If you go through an insurance company, you'll usually have to get 2 or 3 of those for every surgery. And if you pay out of pocket, I have not seen a doctor who doesn't require at least 1 letter. And out of pocket, we're talking, depending on what surgery you're getting, we're talking somewhere between $5,000 to upwards of $150,000. So these people either have access to healthcare, or they have access or the means to raise these funds, and they have gone through all of the hoops to have this surgery. Whether or not that surgery is going to help them, whether or not they're going to regret that surgery later on, that's what they needed at the time. And we're not here to tell them that that was a bad decision, because that's their healthcare and that's their decision, and it does not affect you. And if you think, well, if they hadn't been in the wait list, then there would have been 1 less person, I don't think that's true. I think if you're in a wait list of 15 people, those 15 people would have been there. Whether or not they're detransitioners, whether or not they're trenders, if one of them turns out to be a trender and they were not on the list, someone else would have been there. You still would have been 15th in line. No one else's transition has any effect on your transition. The second thing is that the community might be taken less seriously if people see a lot of people who are pretending to be trans to be cool, or who transition and then end up detransitioning. I see where you're coming from, but I think that they are taking us less seriously because we're constantly infighting. We're constantly fighting about what it means to be trans, and we're constantly fighting about who is trans and who's not trans, instead of just saying, if you're trans, you're trans, and having all of us go and move forward in society versus fighting within each other. We all just need to come together and accept that if you say you're trans, that's what you are. And we move on and we take those with us who are willing to fight for our cause. And then the last thing is that informed consent could possibly have damaging effects on people who are not really trans. If you don't know what informed consent is, here in America we have doctors that you can go to, and they'll just show you a list of the effects of hormone treatment. It outlines like how long different things will take to affect your body, what things will happen if you go off of hormones, and what things will happen if you stay on hormones. And then you just read through that, you sign off and say, I agree that these are things that I'm consenting to, and then you get a prescription for hormones. This is how I got access to my hormones. And you know what? My access to hormones did not affect your transition. It did not affect my fiance's transition. It did not affect anyone's transition, because it was my transition, and that's what I decided to do for my body and for my healthcare. And it has no bearing on anything in your life. So maybe there are people who are trenders who pretend to be trans to be cool, and maybe there are people who detransition, but those people made that decision for themselves, and it has no effect on you as a person. Let's talk about what might motivate someone to transition if they don't have dysphoria. You know, one of the big questions is, why would you transition if you had no motivation to do that? The main point that I want to make is that everyone transitions for a different reason. My reason for transitioning is different than your reason for transitioning is different from everyone else's. Even if it's a minute difference, it's still a difference. And so if we can agree that there are a million different ways to transition, if we can agree that you can transition with no hormones, you can transition with no surgery, if we can agree on that, then why can't we agree that there's a way to transition with no dysphoria? I came up with some other reasons than dysphoria that might motivate people to transition. And I can't say who has these feelings because I have an experience with dysphoria, but I can't rule out that these are valid ways to transition. One motivation that I came up with was that maybe you are content in your body, but all of the media that is being shown to you is that if you're trans, you have to have dysphoria and you have to have some sort of distress. And so in order to be seen as trans enough, you go through and do some medical decision. You go on hormones or you have surgery because that is what you think you need to do in order to be seen as real. And maybe those people regret doing those things and maybe they don't. But once again, that was their decision and it had no effect on your transition. And the fact that they did it, even though they didn't have dysphoria, that was their decision. Another thing that we've been touching on is gender euphoria, and this idea that you can be happy about your gender without feeling any distress about your assigned sex. A good way that I like to explain this is imagine a scale from 0 to 10, and 0 is dysphoria and 10 is euphoria. Somewhere in the middle is just content, is just okay, you're just fine. It's just another day. So if someone has their assigned sex at birth and they're just content with it, they're not necessarily distressed or uncomfortable. They're not necessarily overjoyed. They're just living their life. And someone comes along and recognizes them as another gender and that makes them happy, then maybe they would transition to that gender because it makes them happier. Not necessarily because they were uncomfortable in the first place, but just because they knew that they could be happier as another gender. I think as society keeps progressing and they become more accepting and they become more educated about our community, we're not going to have to be tied to this negative feeling of dysphoria. There's already a generation of young trans people who are being supported by their parents as their gender identity as soon as they assert it. There are kindergartners. They can use whatever bathroom they want. And there are people who have grown up in their asserted gender identity and have no dysphoria about their body because they were never taught to hate that body. So I think this idea of a discussion about do you need dysphoria to be trans, I don't think it should be on the table because there are trans people who don't have dysphoria. They exist. They've told us that they exist. So we need to recognize them. We can't exclude them from our community because we had shitty transitions, because they have happy lives and that's what we always wanted, or whatever. I'm not projecting. So, you know what? We all just need to accept each other as we are at whatever time we come out. We need to say, if you say you're trans, and that's the way it is. And then maybe people won't pretend to be trans because it won't be a fad. It'll just be something that we say, okay, yeah, you're trans. And then they'll go, oh wait, I was just playing a joke. And then we'll go, okay, that was fucked up, but fine, You need to stop worrying about other people's lives and worrying about other people's transitions and just worry about our community and moving our community forward in a positive way. And I think the start to that is acceptance and just saying that you belong. So with that, if you have something to say, I'm totally willing to listen. If you have another point of view, then I'm totally willing to hear you out. But it needs to be respectful and it needs to be a discussion and not an argument. So I will see you in the comments. And until then, stay safe and take care of each other. All of each other.